Baby, everything is alright. Uptight, out of sight. Thank you. Well, you know, there's some people out in the world who always want to tell me about everything that's wrong. I'm not sure what the realization is that they're trying to bring me to, but I'm not getting it. I don't consider that there's anything wrong with the world or the people in the world other than that they're still evolving. Things are what they are. And if you don't like it, change your mind or make them better. I personally like the attitude, everything is all right. You remember Diana Ross and the Supremes? Baby, everything is all right. Uptight, out of sight. Baby, everything is all right. Uptight, out of sight. Hey, I've gone through 3 hurricanes in the last 2 months. And I've had 2 trees fall through my roof. I've sweat off 30 pounds doing physical labor. And I'm still humming to myself. And if I'm wrong, well, that's all right too. This all right attitude, it's what connects you with the higher self. Everything is all right. And if the ego self has secondaries, they're all right too. Anyway, I really came today because I want to tell you, you're all right. And if I can only convince you of one thing, that's it. You are all right. I want to tell you my hurricane story. We're out here. Between the first and second hurricane, there was a gas shortage in Florida, and the supplies were rationed. And for the few gas stations that had power, there were long lines. And I had to wait in my truck for 2 hours to purchase a 5-gallon can of gasoline, one of those red jerry cans like the Army uses. And I finally got it, and I was on my way home, and I saw another man, and he was like pushing his truck off the road, and his wife was trying to steer, and she looked like she was really nervous and scared. So I stopped and I helped him push his truck into a parking lot. Good Samaritan, right? Well, I asked him what was wrong, and I was hoping for dead battery. No, he was out of gas. You know that moment when the universe tests you? I have a can of gas in the back of my truck, and he needs it. And I don't catch all the tests that the universe throws at me, but this one was really obvious. So I took the red jerry can out of my truck and I gave it to him. And the man offered to pay, but it was sort of an empty gesture because both he and I knew what the value of gas was and how hard it was to get. And I said, forget it. Pass it on. Help the next guy. And he asked where I lived, and I told him, and then I drove off. Now, I actually felt pretty good. And I felt better than even if I had the gas. Because there's a satisfaction in kindness that it's unlike any other joy that you experience. Unselfish service to others always leaves you feeling a little bit better about yourself. So I went to the office, and even though I was 2 or 3 hours late, I was on top of the world, happy. Everything is all right, uptight, baby. And you know, I would have been miserable and angry all day if I'd withheld that gas. And it reminded me that if I want to be happy, all I need to do is be kind. What a concept. Anyway, that night I went home, and the jerry can was waiting for me by my front gate, and it had been refilled. What a really good world it can be, you know? And that, to me, has the feeling of an enlightened planetary civilization. And I know that his kindness in returning the gas made him happy. So you can make a good world just by being kind. Now, speaking of good world, as you can see, once again, the trainers have invited me to talk to you. Harry, please talk at the pro course. Just a short talk, so people can see you. Well, I don't know. What would I talk about? And this time it was Zavra who took the bait. Oh, talk about anything. Yes! There it is, carte blanche. Harry unleashed. Talk about anything. Avra just realized she made a mistake. Too late. Let's see, what would anything include? Oh, enough about anything. Let's talk about me. As some of you know, underneath this urban, super sophisticated identity is a simple country boy. Yes, it's true. A country boy who has dabbled in farming and gardening, raising animals most of his life. In fact, at this very moment, his swimming pool is home to 500 thriving, happy tilapia. All swimming into the current. You probably heard him tell that story. Let me tell you what that simple country boy learned from farming. In the 60s, he took a class in botany, but it was pretty boring. He skipped most of the lectures, and the deadline for the final term paper kind of snuck up on him. And at the last minute, he turned in a one-page, two-word term paper. Everything grows. It was botany class, right? He felt this was a very profound statement. It may have had something to do with what he was smoking at the time. Everything grows, man. Everything grows. I told you it was the 60s. But this was a Lucy in the sky diamond mine cognition. Everything grows. And he hoped that the professor would see the wisdom of that insight, and maybe the professor did. But he sent the paper back marked with an F, and he had scribbled in red, "and dies." Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it. The country boy thought the professor had a pretty negative attitude, kind of pre-adolescent issues. Definitely not a Diana Ross fan. And this was in a time before the country boy had met Avra, and he was still very good at getting in the last word. I'm going to pay for that. So he turned it back in. Under the professor's "and dies," he wrote, "What dies?" Well, he not only flunked botany class, he became really insufferable to his friends. He kept injecting into every conversation, "You know, everything grows." "How are you doing, Harry?" "Everything grows." People started to avoid him, so he had a t-shirt made that said, "Everything grows." I'll tell you honestly, right there, he figured that he pretty much knew everything there was to know. Growth is the purpose of life. Now, a few years later, he had occasion to grow green beans for a health food store. And there wasn't much profit in it, but it kept him out of trouble. Relatively out of trouble. You see, it was the health food store where Avra worked. Okay, the truth. He raised organic green beans so he could go into town and see Avra. What? How do you meet girls? Anyway, as an experiment, he spread compost on some rows of green beans, and he left other rows to fend for themselves. And a month later, the beans that received the compost were almost twice the size of their neighbors. You go, whoa, another diamond mine cognition. Anything can be left to develop naturally, or it can be influenced to grow faster. That's probably what he should have learned in the botany class. If he ever gets another shot at a botany term paper, he'll say, anything can be left to develop naturally, or it can be influenced to grow faster. Things can be influenced to grow faster. And at that moment, he was a self-realized organic gardener. He looked up in the clouds and he said, okay, God, I'm ready for the next assignment. And I wish I could tell you that the skies opened or something, or even that a crow flew over and pooped on his head. But that's not what happened. What did happen was he began to hear this tiny sound of chewing, and it was getting increasingly louder. And he lifted a bean leaf, and underneath there was a mob of green caterpillars devouring his bean crop. And since he couldn't use insecticides, it presented him with a problem. It was one of those existential moments. He was at a crossroads in his pursuit of truth and Avra. He could plant resistant beans, or he could pretend to Avra that he was raising caterpillars for medical research. And just as he was about to decide in favor of the caterpillar story, a horny toad hopped out and began gobbling up the caterpillars. He's raising horny toads. What was God trying to tell him? And he considered several seductive stories about why he was raising horny toads, but they fell kind of flat in the telling. So he decided to give up lying, at least for a day. Now, the idea that really came out of that period was that growth and development of human consciousness could be accelerated. So that's what is true education, as opposed to indoctrinating beliefs in someone. This is what education's really about. And he took that realization and he went back to teaching. Now, the key questions are: what influences are favorable to the development of an enlightened consciousness, and why? And these are the questions that philosophers and spiritual teachers have been asking themselves for the last 5,000 years. If you could strip any political, religious, or spiritual practice back to its unblemished core, you would find someone's opinion about what influences are favorable to the development of higher consciousness. Unfortunately, the opinions aren't always correct. One of the classic allegories of Western civilization is called Plato's allegory of the cave. How many of you know it? It used to be more classic than that. An allegory is a story with a hidden meaning or a teaching. And in the allegory of the cave, Plato portrays people as sitting in front of a wall in a dark cave, and behind the people is a fire with figurines, little dolls, and the dolls go back and forth through the light of the fire, and they cast shadows on the wall in front of the people. Now, the people don't see the fire, and they never look at the dolls. They only regard the shadows that the dolls cast on the wall in front of them. And the people come to believe that these shadows are reality. And they suffer greatly as a consequence of their belief. You've probably had Avatar students come to you believing that the universe was the source of their unhappiness. Or they're chasing shadows. The people in Plato's allegory believe the shadows are reality because they know nothing but shadows, and they assume that there is nothing but shadows. The principal obstruction to their awakening is the belief that they feel they're already awake. And one day, by fate or by circumstance, maybe by accident, one individual turns his head around. Plato uses the pronoun he, but it might just as well have been a woman. And as he turns his head around, he sees the dolls going back and forth in front of the fire. And in that moment, he realizes that the shadows are only shadows, and that the suffering is caused by ignorance. And if he's anything like the rest of us, he probably goes back briefly to watching the shadows and suffering. And maybe the experience will not last, but at least now he knows. And he has had this extraordinary moment of consciousness in which he realized that the shadows were shadows. Call it an avatar initiation. And having seen the truth, it will tug at him until he finally walks out of the cave, walks into the sunlight. And we call that going to Wizards. Now, he'd like to stay out in the sunlight for the rest of his life, but he feels an obligation to the fellows who are still suffering, who still believe in the shadows, and who believe there is nothing but shadows. How to enlighten them. If he goes back into the cave and he tries to tell the truth, they won't understand him. They won't believe him. They've never heard the word sunlight. They will feel that he's insane and a troublemaker. And he'll either end up imprisoned in the shadow world or even maybe crucified, because his words about sunlight are meaningless to the people who have only seen cave shadows. The principal obstruction to awakening is the belief that you're already awake. Now, while this statement is quite true, there is within it this sense of being made wrong. You know, what do you mean I'm not awake? It's a threat to the ego. And this is not fertile ground for self-development, self-growth. This is definitely not Diana Ross singing, everything is all right, uptight. But eventually, if he survives long enough, Plato's realized being grows smart enough to circumvent the ignorance and the intolerance of the shadow watchers. He does wizards. He gains the ability to understand and manage creation. He operates from the viewpoint of higher self without needing approval or applause. He simply takes responsibility for transforming these people, transforming civilization. He learns how to inspire. And he inspires the people who are trapped and suffering in their shadow reality. He learns how to get them to turn around and see the light without making them wrong. Baby, everything is all right. Uptight, out of sight.